Now, last week we dealt with half of this chapter. Not last week, but the week before, sorry. We dealt with half of this chapter. We kind of spent most of our time up in the top portion between verses 1 and 8, for example. And then I told you guys that I wanted you to take a look and that we were going to talk about this covenant of circumcision. And that there was some interesting stuff going on here regarding the Hebrew words for circumcised and foreskin. And we're not going to be talking about, what you think we're going to be talking about, I don't think. But the spiritual significance of these things. Yeah. So I think what I will do is I'll just read, I'll reread for you a section of this, the section that we're going to deal with. And this is basically God in the beginning says, I'm going to do this for you and that for you, exceedingly fruitful nations, kings, your seed after you. And then he says in verse 9, Genesis 18:9 is where Abram is given the instructions for here's your part of this covenant. This is what you have to do.
17:9.
Is it? Are we in chapter 17? I apologize. I was studying 18 for thinking we might get there, but I don't think we're gonna. But anyway, here we go. So Genesis 17, verse 9. I apologize. So God spoke to Abraham and said, as for you, guard my covenant, you and your seed after you, throughout their generations. And this is my covenant, which you will guard between you and me and your seed after you. Every male child among you is to be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. You might want to make an asterisk next to that. And it shall become a sign of the covenant between me and you. So you'll note, first of all, that this is not only the covenant, but it is also the sign of the covenant. And a son of 8 days is circumcised by you, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with silver, that is redeemed from any foreigner who is not of your seed, he who is born in your house and he who is bought or redeemed with your silver has to be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And an uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, his life shall be cut off from my people. He has broken or violated my covenant. And then he begins to talk with Abraham about Sarai, and he's going to give him a son by her, and he fell on his face and laughed. He said, is a child going to be born to me? So then we get into, what about my other son Ishmael? Let him live before you. Now, many of your translations might say no. Does your translation say no? In verse 18, let Ishmael live before you. And Elohim said no. Does your translation say no? The word no is not there.
In verse 19 or 18? I have O in 18.
Well, it starts in 18. O begins where Abraham speaks. Let Ishmael live before you. But then God spoke back in verse 19 and said, does he say no?
He says Lu is what it says, and that's typically translated as no. Does it mean, but I think it can mean something else.
It means nevertheless.
Nevertheless?
Mine just says your wife Sarah shall bear.
I know lo is no, but this says Lu.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. You look at the translation, most Bibles will say no. He's not going to live before me. But it literally says, in a sense, if you want to look at it in a literal sense, Abraham says, let Ishmael live before you. And God said, let me draw your attention to Sarah. He didn't even answer the question. He just kind of skipped right over it. He glossed over it and said, indeed, Sarah is going to bear you a child. So he just kind of glossed over Abraham's question. But did he though? No. Because he comes back, I have heard, in verse 20, As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I shall bless him and make him fruitful and greatly increase him. He's going to bring forth 12 princes, and I'll make him a great nation. Was that fulfilled? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Abraham then took his son Ishmael and all those who were born in his house and every male among his house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins on that very day. And Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. Did you know that many of the Arabs will circumcise their children when they're 13 years old? Because of this passage? That sucks. That is unfortunate.
13 years.
Because of the tradition of Ishmael being circumcised when he was 13, many who are religiously guided in that direction will circumcise their 13-year-old children and not follow the instructions saying a son of 8 days. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. I'd rather have it done when I was not, able to remember it. It had 8 days. It'd be much easier, in my opinion. And there's also something to be said for, this is a kind of a passive thing, frankly. I mean, you think about this, and most people don't, that yes, Abraham and all of his male servants and people who converted to Judaism throughout human history, and even today, if they're not circumcised, and now generally physical circumcision is practiced in most countries of the world, but not all. But people who do convert to rabbinic Judaism will actually become physically circumcised as adults. But most children around the world are circumcised as children. But remember that this is the instructions are that it can be done actively as an adult. The decision is made, an action is performed, or passively on a child who, he doesn't have any say in the matter. It just kind of happens to him. He has no input. What does that say to you?
I have a question about
Sure.
that because in verse 14, it talks about the one who is not circumcised, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. How can a baby break the covenant, make a choice to break the covenant?
Yeah, they can't.
Right. So
That's
I
a
just
good-
find that so confusing.
Great point. Now let me ask you a question, and this phraseology that you have just suggested is used all over the Hebrew Scriptures. Cut off. This person shall be cut off. What does that mean to you?
Exiled.
Exiled? Okay.
Because other times it refers to specific things requiring death penalty.
Okay. Anyone else? The Hebrew word, and you should make a note of this and look at the Hebrew word for when it says cut off. And the visual imagery of that is most closely associated with a limb that becomes infected and poisonous and must be amputated in order to save the body. That is literally the interpretation of this word for cut off. Now, in your estimation, in your own wisdom and the Spirit of God that is in you, why would a person need to be cut off from his people? What would the point be?
Infecting the rest of the body.
Yes, he is infecting the rest of the body. And I would say that Nathan is right in some instances, that sometimes it can be exile. Like when you read in Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 9, when it says, I did not write to you to abstain from fellowshipping with people in the world, because then you'd have to leave the world. But I wrote to you instead to not associate with any so-called believer who is a this or a that, a drunkard or a swindler, So he said that person needs to be excised, and he talks about, I have delivered such a one over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Sometimes sick sheep need to be quarantined, asked politely to not come back for a little while until you can, get your poop in a group, because you're going to infect the other believers. Doesn't mean they're necessarily a wolf.
It's
Could
interesting that same word, though, is also used for when Zipporah cuts off the foreskin of Gershom.
Oh, cuts off. Yes. Yes, that is interesting. Very, very
Because
much.
we've had so much speculation about who's this text talking about,
Right.
about who's getting killed.
Right.
Moses.
Moses or the kid, right.
Or the kid,
Yeah. Most commentaries will say that Zipporah cut off the foreskin of Gershom in order to save the life of Moses because he had failed to carry out that command when he went out among the Gentiles, married a Gentile woman, had a child by her, and did not keep the command to circumcise that child. That's most commentators. So it's obviously open to interpretation. But cut off, same word. Good point.
Kind of see where that would overlap, right? Like, if that piece wasn't cut off, it would have infected the body
Sure.
as Moses went in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would have, frankly, I think the point maybe there is that it would have, not invalidated, but it would have damaged Moses' testimony to the children of Israel. You're a great prophet who's come out of the desert, called by God to come and tell us what's up, huh? And you don't even circumcise your own children. It's for the exact same reason I can see that Timothy got circumcised by Paul, but Titus did not. Why is that? Because Timothy was the son of a Jewish woman and was interacting among the Jewish community. It would have been a stumbling block. That is why Timothy was circumcised, but Titus was not, because Titus was interacting amongst a bunch of Gentiles and ministering among them. Circumcision of the flesh was no big deal to them. But Timothy, who's going to be ministering to Jews, him not being circumcised would have been a stumbling block, so as not to cause offense. So that makes a little bit of sense. But what I want to do is I want to draw your attention back to verse 11, where this is first discussed. And, you know, there's a lot of time and attention paid by Paul in the book of Galatians, for example, and also a little bit in Corinthians, I'm pretty sure, where he talks about circumcision. A little bit in Romans. First of all, I think once we understand what is being said here, those passages in the New Testament writings, in the Greek scriptures, will make so much more sense to us. Plus a little bit of historical context, okay? So first of all, let's look at these Hebrew words. And I want to draw your attention to something which is kind of interesting, which you'll see in the Hebrew. And in the English, it's not quite the same way. Can you think of, and this has to do with like Hebrew language, can you think of English words that serve as a noun and a verb at the same time that you can use either way? I know I couldn't when I thought of it off the top of my head. I was talking to the children about this. I was like, I just can't think of one, but I know there's a bunch. And then, of course, I did a little research online, and there's like tons of them. There's just hundreds and hundreds. What?
Like work? The word work?
Work, yes. Yeah, that's a good example. Email. Email is a thing, and email is also a verb. I will email you, but I also have an email. Echo is another one. You can echo someone, or an echo is a thing. So there are verbs and nouns that are the same word. In Hebrew, that's not usually the case. And this is where our Strong's Concordance can sometimes not give us a really full picture. Remember when I pointed your attention to these words circumcise and foreskin, that the word foreskin is not even, it's translated as foreskin like every single time you see that word, but what the Strong's will not show you is that there is a incredibly similar Hebrew word which is in the verb form, because Hebrew has verb forms and noun forms. What is the noun form of foreskin when you look at it in your little Strong's Concordance that's attached to your King James or whatever it is that you're using? The word foreskin is the Hebrew word Orlah. Orlah. And the word Orlah is a noun and is almost exclusively used of foreskin in the Bible. But there is a verb form of that same word, which when you look at that, gives you some very interesting insight into what this word literally can be better interpreted as. That word is erev. Okay, and that is, it's like one Hebrew number. If Orlah is Hebrew root 1635, then erev is 1636. They're right next to each other, and they're very, very similar, but one is a verb and one is a noun. And I want to show you some examples, it's erel,
Yeah.
Orlah and erel. Okay, so I want to show you some examples of where this word is used as a verb in order to gain some insight into what is this whole foreskin thing. And it's not the literal act of sharpening your pencil. Okay? That's also a metaphor. In case you missed that, I apologize. Did that just go right over your heads?
No.
You were trying to ignore it. Okay, good. That's good.
We're trying to encourage you. Is what
I know. Don't encourage me to be incorrigible. I know.
I'm just totally lost.
Okay.
On my strong, for the word foreskin, in mine, it says H6190,
Right.
Orlah.
Right.
Feminine of H6189, the prepuce.
Prepuce. That is the actually
Foreskin
physical.
and uncircumcised.
Right.
That's not what you're saying, is it?
No. What I'm saying is that your Strong's Concordance is not a dictionary. Just remember that. That's one of the, and I've mentioned that before, and we oftentimes forget this. A Strong's Concordance is not a Hebrew dictionary. It is limited. It will give you a tremendous amount of great information. One thing it won't tell you is when you punch in that little Hebrew word, it's going to give you the 3-letter root, but it's going to leave off all of those little sticky letters that Angie keeps telling you about. It's like, well, this doesn't ever match up to me. And it took me a while to figure that out, that all these sticky Hebrew letters, all these prepositions and stuff like in or this one or that one or ha or yod attached to the word to make it make sense. The Strong's Concordance isn't going to give you that. And that was what I was pointing out, is that the Strong's Concordance, when you click on that Hebrew root letter there, it's going to say Orlah, and all it's going to say is foreskin. But there is another Hebrew word which is incredibly similar to Orlah, which is called erel, which is the verb form of the same Hebrew word. And when you look at that, and see, I don't even know that does the Strong's show you the word erel at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of them will, if you click on this as an origin from, or maybe a derivative of. Is that in there, Gracie?
Yes.
6189, but I don't know how to make it go back to that.
Okay, so in some cases it will be connected, and that's good. That's good. So what I want to show you is, let's take a look at the way this verb form is actually used, and maybe gain a little bit of insight into what is this foreskin thing. Okay, look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, and I'll read it for you. If you just want to write it down as a note, you don't have to go flipping through or whatever. That's okay. But in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16, Deuteronomy 10:16 says, God chose us above all peoples, and ye shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart. This is where Paul draws attention to this several times. Does your heart have a foreskin? You going to the doctor to get your foreskin removed from your heart? I don't think so. Yesterday.
You're removing it from your foot.
They put a stent in it.
Okay, so there's one example, and maybe you write that down. Heart. Okay? A heart has a foreskin, according to the text. Now, I want you to take a look at Exodus 6, verse 12. In Exodus 6, verse 12, it says that Moshe spoke before Yehovah, saying, the children of Israel have not listened to me. And why would Pharaoh listen to me? For I am a man of uncircumcised lips. I have a foreskin on my lips. That doesn't make much sense. His lips are uncircumcised. It's just this same word in verb form. You're imagining it, aren't you?
Yes.
Don't do that.
No.
Okay. Now, we have heart that is uncircumcised. We also have lips that are uncircumcised. Now, if you look at Jeremiah 6, Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 10, he says, "To whom shall I speak and give warning so that they can hear? Behold, their ear is uncircumcised, and they are unable to listen. Behold, the word of Yehovah is a reproach to them, and they do not delight in it." So far we have uncircumcised hearts, uncircumcised lips, uncircumcised ears. Gives you a little insight into Jesus always saying, "Let him who has an ear to hear."
Almost seems like a replacement for the word veil.
Hold that thought. Fabulous, fabulous idea. He said it seems like a replacement for the word veil. Great, great insight. Okay, now the final one I want to show you is in Leviticus chapter 19. So look at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 23. Leviticus 19:23 says, "And when you come into the land and have planted all kinds of trees for food, then you shall reckon their fruit as uncircumcised. For 3 years it is as uncircumcised to you. It is not eaten."
Can you read the next two verses?
I certainly can. "And in the 4th year all of its fruit is holy or kadosh, praises to Yehovah. And in the 5th year you shall eat its fruit, so that it increases its yield to you. I am Yehovah your Elohim."
So there's a, they're comparing it. There's uncircumcised and holy, right? So that would maybe uncircumcised would mean a comment, in that holy means set apart.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So when you look at these different ways, we now have that a heart can be uncircumcised, your lips can be uncircumcised, your ears can be uncircumcised, and trees are uncircumcised. The tree thing is really where this thing kind of hits home and starts to make a little bit of sense. And Nathan said it's kind of like a veil. Your heart has got something, it's a veil maybe, or something is between your heart and God's commandments, right? Like Jeremiah says in chapter 31, he's going to take this new covenant and put his Torah in your hearts, right? Because there was something, you needed to have an uncircumcised heart because there's something between you and God. And of course, he didn't put it there, right? There's an uncircumcision of your heart. You can't hear his words. It seems like this is in the book of Jeremiah, it seemed intentional. It's like they can't hear. Their ears are uncircumcised. Moses couldn't speak because his lips were uncircumcised. And the fruits of these trees are considered as uncircumcised, meaning you can't touch it. It is blocked, cut off from you. Okay, Tracy?
Do you have, I don't want to jump ahead, but do you have a reference to Matthew 15 when Messiah talks about the hypocrites?
No, please bring that forth.
So what you said, this popped in my head, is when he's speaking to those hypocritical people that are keeping the tradition over the commandment and not honoring their father and mother and whatnot. Matthew 15:7, starting there, he says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draws near to me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching doctrines for commandments of men." And he called the multitude unto them and said, "Hear and understand."
Yeah.
He touches on all of those
Absolutely.
uncircumcised things just in that little.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So if we had to kind of make a paraphrase, and I'm going to kind of wrap this up and put a little bow on it for you, okay? We need to be circumcised in the sense that whatever is blocking us needs to be cut off. The word circumcised literally means to cut it off, get it out of the way. And these other things that we've been talking about give us an insight into what needs to be cut off. So what is it that needs to be cut off? The foreskin of the flesh. You notice that is in there? The foreskin of the flesh. That is why circumcision is so important, but not in the physical sense. It was in the physical sense as a sign of this covenant. But what is the literal covenant? What is the literal covenant is you must remove the blockage of your flesh if you're going to serve this God. Your flesh has to be removed. Not the flesh, not a fleshy part of your body, although many times our Hebrew brothers and sisters will take a spiritual commandment and turn it into a physical one, when God didn't necessarily tell them to do that. There's only one commandment that I'm aware of, aside from haircutting stuff, and that one's a great big mystery, that where God gave his commandment to people to say, here's something that I want you to do that is literal and visible, and that is what it is, and that is tzitzit. That is the only commandment in the Torah that I'm aware of where he says, I want you to literally and physically do this. It's something that will stick out like a sore thumb, but it also has a spiritual meaning. Why does he want you to do it? So that you don't follow after your eyes, and it'll help you to remember the commandments of our God. That is the only physical, real thing that you can touch, which is a commandment that is just visible to everyone else. Your foreskin, I certainly think, is not going to be visible to everyone else. That is a very private, thing, a sign of the covenant that is between you and God. It's a private thing. But, like I said, our Hebrew brothers and sisters for many generations have physically interpreted, spiritually founded commandments. And that's fine. That's fine if you want to do that. That's a tradition. You want to wear the scriptures in front of your eyes, put a box on your head, wrap it around your hand, great. No problem with that. But just we need to realize that is a physical interpretation of a spiritual commandment. I think we can see here that circumcision was also interpreted in a physical way, when that's maybe not necessarily what God was talking about. Or maybe it's both, as Angela likes to point out. Angela and then Gracie.
Seriously as well.
Yeah, good point.
What?
Take it seriously.
It's enforced seriously. It's a big deal, and it's specifically mentioned as being a covenant unto all generations.
Absolutely. And then we're going to dig into that a little bit more. Angela?
Well, it's interesting that the part that they did choose to use as the physical act is the intimate part that's used for multiplication.
Yes, the whole idea of a seed is, I think, critical to this understanding. A fruit tree bears seed. The male organ bears seed. The word is the seed, which is blocked from coming into your ears, and out of the heart the mouth speaks. If you've got the wrong seed in your heart, what's coming out of your mouth is unclean, and you know what I'm saying? So I think that the whole idea of a seed being blocked is also incumbent upon this passage. Tracy?
Is that word for unharvested also maybe a good one?
That might be something,
Harvest.
yeah. Not what, well,
In relation to,
Leviticus?
no, to the word foreskin.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
If I'm understanding this
Don't
correctly.
take a look at it and let me know if you find anything interesting there, because that sounds like it could be a potentially interesting thing. Gracie?
I just wanted you to clarify, you're not saying that in Exodus where we're reading about this, that it wasn't meaning literal.
Oh, you mean here in Genesis?
Yeah, Genesis.
Okay, yeah. No, I am not suggesting that. Well, I may even be going so far as to say that God said, "You shall circumcise the flesh of your Orlah," and I'll tell you why. And I'll go ahead and give you a preview. Okay, in just a couple of chapters, God is going to appear when Isaac, his son, has been born and is now a young man. He's not a child, a young man, probably in his 30s. And he says, I want you to offer him as a whole burnt offering. And he says, okay, I'm taking this child up to Mount Moriah, I'm going to bind him up, put him on the altar, I'm going to take the knife, and all of a sudden God says, don't do that. The binding of Isaac, the Akedah. If you look at that, what the explicit instructions that God gives to Abraham, what he says is, I want you to give me your son as an ascending offering. Again, a very spiritual concept. I want you to sacrifice your son to me. I don't think, and there is plenty of evidence in both rabbinic commentaries and in just the words that are used there, that God did not intend for Abraham to kill his son. That is how Abraham interpreted the instructions. He didn't know how do I make it. What God literally said was, I want you to make your son go up to me. I want you to offer your son as an ascending offering. Make him go up to me. How does he do that? How do I offer you my son? Because I think, this goes back to that blood covenant thing that we were talking about just a couple of weeks ago. The exchange of sons. We know that God's going to give his son to save the people of Abraham. And we know that Abraham is now being asked to give up his son, but in a way that he doesn't understand. And so he takes that commandment literally and says, I guess God wants me to slaughter this child. He's the promised son. He's going to have to raise him from the dead or something, because he told me that this kid's going to be the multitude of nations.
That's the whole point.
Yes.
Is that God knew that Abraham wouldn't have to go all that far, but he knew that Abraham was willing to go all that far. I don't think Abraham knew that he would be willing to until he actually did, but he said God will provide, and God did provide.
Sure.
But I think that God intended him to go do what he did,
I-
as far as he went. I think that's exactly
Well,
what God
You can
wanted.
tell by what he says next. He says, since you did not hesitate to
Yes.
give
Since
your
you
own
did not hesitate.
son.
Right.
To spare your own son. I don't know the exact wording.
And we'll look at that when we get to it. But there is, and I'm just throwing
I mean,
that out there to you.
From what I'm taking of what you're saying about the circumcision is that there is a legitimate argument that God didn't intend for the physical circumcision, the blood, the actual flesh.
That's a great question, and I'll let Angela. She seems like she's wanting to say something about
because
that.
I don't think he's intending to say that like Moses made a mistake and that circumcision is just. But I think.
No, I'm absolutely
That
not.
would
I'm
be
not
an awful
Moses,
lot
but
of blood
Abraham. But
flowing for nothing.
if God said to Abraham, remove the blockage of your flesh, and Abraham chose to do it that way, God didn't stop him. He probably looked at that and said, that'll work. That is not. That's a very simple and physical, not simple, but that's a very physical gesture of what I'm talking about, and we'll see how this runs much deeper, to including the heart and the lips and but.
That's a good point. And please don't hear me say that I'm saying that Abraham made a mistake or something, and that was not God's intention. It may have been,
Well,
but
it's far-reaching if it wasn't God's intention.
no, it absolutely is far-reaching. But it's far more far-reaching as a spiritual principle than it is as a physical one. And if you read you know what the Mishnah is? The Mishnah is ancient Bible commentaries that were around in the time of Jesus. And in fact, some of the sayings of Jesus match almost exactly these Hebrew commentaries of the Torah that date back to the time of Jesus. They come across this passage and they have written pages and pages and pages saying, how did Abraham interpret this as the foreskin of the male member? Because it's not what it says in the Hebrew. They puzzled over this and said, why did he interpret it that way? And then they go to all of these different passages that I talked about and figured out he probably had to figure it out for himself as well. And think about, you want me to cut off the flesh of blockage. Would have been a literal interpretation. And he had to figure out, how do I do that? And he did the best he could. And the rabbis for thousands of years have said, how did he figure that out? He looked at different ways that you can interpret that word, and he did the best he could. And like Angie said, God didn't stop him. God said, look at you. You're awesome. I appreciate your attempt, and that's great. It's a good symbol for what I'm trying to do. You chose wisely because you removed a blockage from the male organ that has to do with seed, and that's a pretty good picture of what I'm trying to show you. as we walk, remember he said right at the beginning, my covenant is between me and you, walk before me and become tamim.
So what else could he have done?
I can't imagine what else he could have done. I think that was a perfect physical
I think
representation.
the Holy Spirit led him.
Okay, I'll accept that 100%, that the Holy Spirit
I mean,
led
these things
Abraham.
Don't happen by happenstance.
No, and
It's
I
not,
don't-
Oh, he got lucky.
And I don't want you to think that Abraham just willy-nilly decided, well, hey, this looks good, and there it went. And no, I think that the Spirit of God was leading him, and that this was a good interpretation of how to apply this spiritual principle.
And the conversation was on also Isaac and Ishmael, right?
Yes.
So he knows that there's going to be another son of
Right.
his seed.
Right. That's a good point, too. Yeah. Tracy?
The Torah is spiritual. That's what Paul tells us.
Right.
The Torah is spiritual, and those who worship God must worship him in spirit and truth.
Right.
Messiah said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you.
And
Is that literal?
people tripped out on that,
Or
didn't
is
know
that
what to do with it.
spiritual?
Yeah.
It's spiritual. He didn't
Right.
want you to start eating his flesh.
Right.
And there's a connection here, too, I think.
Well, hold on. You can see that the Catholics have actually
Right.
taken
and that's
that
because
literally.
the flesh cannot hear the language, the spiritual language.
Yes.
That's why. This
There's
is a
a
language
perfect
that is
example.
meant for only the Spirit, and only Messiah, who died and rose again to send that Spirit to teach you, can teach it to you. Unless
Sure.
you abide in that vine, and that's connecting what I wanted to say next, is this word circumcised. In the Strong's here, it means to become clipped, and it compares it to a branch being cut down.
Good
So if
insight.
we look over to the what Messiah talks about, I am the vine, you are the branches.
Mhm.
Every branch in me not bearing fruit, he takes away, the Father, because the Father is the vine dresser.
Right.
And he prunes, he takes away what is dead.
Right.
So that you may bear more fruit and
Absolutely.
produce. And
Good
that's
insight.
this picture of the seed and the word, and
Yep.
this literal picture of what Abraham was doing.
Good
And
insight.
maybe that's the will be cut off.
And that's what he says in Romans. He says, for unbelief, the branches were cut off. So if you're cut
Yeah.
off, that means
Says you have a blockage of flesh, you
Mhm.
cannot produce fruit, and so you are cut off like the vine, so that you can produce.
Brilliant insight. Mike?
I think too, like things are going to start kind of rapidly moving forward after this part, right? After
Yeah.
this chapter.
Right.
So in Leviticus, when you were talking about 3 years they're uncircumcised, and then in the 4th year it's going to bear fruit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and then in this chapter it talks about on the 8th day is when the circumcision happens.
Yeah.
So 8 times 3 is 24, and this is the 24th year since he left his father's house.
Yes, it is.
So
Excellent insight. Excellent insight. Very cool. That's very true. Yes.
Okay, I am not an expert in Hebrew.
None of us are.
But I've heard this. I have not been able to verify it, but I think it might apply. So there's a couple words for heart, is what I was told in Hebrew, if I understood it correctly.
Levav and lev.
Right. And that the circumcision relating to the flesh, there's in Levav, there's two. I suppose we could look at this different ways, considering our study of Bob here. But one of the words that I heard describe Bob was a throne. So Levav, two
Lavav
thrones.
is a bait. It's a bait in that word, not a vav.
Okay, I don't know. I'm just going by what they said.
Okay.
So maybe it is more of a house. I don't know.
Yeah.
So two houses
Bed
in
is
your
house, yeah.
in your heart.
That's,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You're talking about having two thrones in your heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
And what the circumcision does is it cuts off one. Which one does it cut off? It cuts off the you
yeah.
part of you,
That
so
is-
that God can be the throne.
Yes.
The house.
That
of
is
your heart.
exactly what Jesus' brother James was talking about with a double-minded man. A double-minded man, literally, if you translate a double-minded person in the Greek, it is one who has two hearts. Whose heart is towards God, but whose heart is also towards himself. He says, God, show me the way, but I'm not really that interested in doing it. I have my own ideas about how the way that this should work out. But he prays to God and says, please show me what I should do with this difficult circumstance, but I've already kind of got an idea in my mind of what I'm going to do. That means you're double-minded.
What's interesting is there's a lot of things that are written in the Talmud about the Orlah and a mixed seed. Like those things are kind of correlated together.
Yeah,
and
good insight.
confirmed.
Yes. We have a lot of information about mixed seed in the Torah as well. That is not a good thing. Gracie, you seemed excited there for a moment.
Well,
What do you got?
that just absolutely blows me away.
What
This
does?
double-minded thing has bothered me for years because I am the type of personality that I can understand why somebody's coming from this direction, and I can understand their argument on that direction. And, you know,
Yeah.
I really can understand both sides of it, and I can see the validity of both sides of it.
Sure.
And I've always thought that that means that I tend to be a double-minded person, and I look at that scripture and I think, Lord, I don't want to be, so I'm always just saying, Lord, show me. But that makes more sense, and I don't have to worry about it because the Lord already knows that I want what is His decision, not
Right.
you know, what my understanding in my own humanness can.
And the essence of doing away with double-mindedness, and this double-mindedness is being uncircumcised. Because when Yeshua was sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, they call it of the Garden of Olive Press, he's getting crushed like an olive pit. He is saying, this sucks. Take this cup away from me. I do not want this. This is not fun. This is not good. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He was willing to set aside what he wanted, the things that were causing him discomfort, that causes his heart to break, and he said, not what I want, but what you want. That's when we are double-hearted, is when we say, what I want. And we give lip service to what he wants.
It's like two-faced.
Two-faced hypocrites. There you go. You're talking
Man
about...
has two sons. One, he says, go work in my vineyard. He says, Father, I go. And he doesn't go.
Exactly.
The other says, I don't want to go, but then he regrets and goes. Which one did the will of the Father? The
Right.
one who went.
Right.
That is producing fruit.
Yep.
The one who hears
Yep.
and does.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So all of this is tied together really, really well. Nathan?
I was just going to say, circumcision, the argument of circumcision is a huge deal. In the first century, it was one of the main arguing points, so much
Yes.
so that Paul referred to people who disagreed with him as the circumcision. That's what he called them,
Yeah.
those who are
Yeah.
of the circumcision.
And that's a great point, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit more. But I'm going to wrap this up and put a little bow on this thing, and then I'd like to talk about that because that's a huge thing. So I want to ask you first: must you be circumcised to be saved?
What is saved?
Must you remove the flesh in order to be saved? Yes, you do. And I'm not saying that's your job, although part of it is you have to struggle against the flesh, but that's what Jesus does, is he nails your flesh and the sins that your flesh causes and the penalty for those sins, he nails them to the tree, right? So does every follower of God have a responsibility to nail their flesh, to overcome their flesh? Yes. Can you be saved by saying a prayer? I think we all have come to the conclusion that grace, faith without works is dead, right? I know that that's the majority opinion here. We're not hyper-grace type of people who just say name it and claim it, and I prayed the prayer when I was 12 and I'm good to go. I punched my ticket for heaven. We are not of that ilk. Okay, so I'll ask you again. Must you be circumcised to be saved? Yes, you must. Physically circumcised? No. That is not the point here. It is spiritual circumcision. We all, in order to... so many scriptures we've been reading over these last many years that we've come into this understanding of why the Torah is still valid. We've gone back and read all these passages from Yeshua saying, the one who does the will of my Father is truly my son. And 1 John saying, the one who practices lawlessness is of the devil. And we have come to discover that if you are not doing the things that God wants you to do, you are not called his son. And if you are not putting to death the deeds of the flesh, you're in trouble. So, we must circumcise our lips, our ears, our heart, in order to be moving towards salvation. Let's put it that way.
And Paul was talking about that, right?
You might think so. You might think so. This is where
Certainly.
this is what people trip
Paul in
up
perspective.
with Paul. People get tripped up and wrapped around the axle with Paul because the Jews come forward and say, these guys can't be saved unless they're circumcised according to the custom of Moses. Now, what are they talking about? Are they talking about circumcision of the heart? Circumcision of the ears? No, they're not. Angela?
What is the custom of Moses?
That is a fabulous key section of that verse, which so many people overlook. And if you read into some first century literature, that does not mean what you think it means. It's because they say, do you want to look at that? Do you want to actually look at that?
Yeah.
Let's take a look at that. Let's turn to Acts chapter 15. So I think we can get some really interesting insights now that we are studying what this whole circumcision thing is.
15, which verse?
Acts chapter 15, starting right at the beginning. Okay. Certain men came down from the region of Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the practice of Moshe, you are unable to be saved. Okay, now I want you to skip down to verse 5, where they repeat this, where it says, and some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees rose up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the Torah of Moshe. Now here are two things that they have said is necessary. What are those two things? They must be circumcised and commanded to keep the Torah of Moses. Now, do we have a problem with keeping the Torah of Moses? No. None of us here. Do we have a problem with them saying you must be circumcised? Well, if we look at it from a spiritual perspective, but they weren't.
Well, Genesis is the Torah.
Yes, it is. Okay. But what I want you to recognize and realize, and I'll give you this information, and I want you to look it up. Don't take my word for it. I want you to take a gander at this if you have the inclination to do so. You'll have to look into some Hebrew sources in order to do this. When a Jew, to any Jew, even today, and certainly in the first century, when Jesus was around, when this very conversation is happening, when you say you must keep the Torah, when they say even today, you must keep the Torah, are they talking about the first 5 books of Moses? That's the Torah, right? That is not what they are talking about. To a Jew, the Torah of Moses does not just refer to, they believe in the written Torah and the oral Torah. The Torah Shaval
That's what
Peh.
they were referring to. We know that's what Jews mean today.
That's what they
But
meant
can't
then.
we say that that's what they would have meant then?
Yes, we can, because if you look at the first century writings in the Talmud, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara, they say the same thing.
And that's what Messiah was admonishing them for.
That is exactly what Yeshua was kept admonishing them about, is that adding of their traditions, because they have a tradition that goes back that says God gave the written Torah to Moses, and then he gave an oral interpretation to Moses, which Moses passed down to the 70 elders, and the 70 elders passed it down to so-and-so, and it came to the great men of the assembly, so that they believe in 2 Torahs.
Don't we have to interpret that selectively? Because if you go from that point, every time you run into the word Torah in the New Testament, is it going to mean the Talmud as well?
Not if you interpret it by the words of Yeshua. And
And you'll never see Yeshua say, don't follow the Torah, whereas you will see him say, don't follow the commands of men.
Yes, absolutely. Angela?
If you look at that verse, it says who's saying it, the sect of the Pharisees, and
That's a key point.
right.
It's absolutely a key point. So I want you to just consider this and look into it. Don't just take my word for it. Like I said, that when a Jew today and then is talking about the Torah, they are not simply talking about the first 5 books of Moses. They are talking about the whole package. That is why, and this will give you some insight. Do you notice how Peter responds to that question when they say, these guys have to be circumcised and be taught to keep the Torah of Moses? Why in the world would he, in verse 10 of Acts chapter 15, say, now then, why do you try God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Peter is saying, why do you want to put a yoke on these new disciples who are following Yeshua that neither we nor our fathers were able to bear? Is the Torah a yoke that you are not able to bear? No, it is not. It says very clearly and plainly in 2 places in the Torah itself, the written part, it says this is not too hard for you. It's not across the sea that you got to go find somebody to get it for you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart. You can do it.
Yeah. I think it's difficult too because people look at the word law in the New Testament and it triggers them to just think that it's always going to be the first 5 books. Right?
Yeah, that's a good
But
point.
I mean, like Paul, he says Torah and law.
Yes.
He refers to all sorts of different things.
He does. That's a key point. Yeah, you have to look at the context and you have to do a little bit of historical research to find out. You can't interpret this Bible from your 21st century eyeballs. It doesn't work. You can't interpret it from men's opinions. You have to do some... I have always been of the opinion that if you're going to study this Bible, you need to know at least a little bit about the people who wrote it and the times they lived in.
Definitely.
You're gonna stick in historical anachronisms when you start plugging in your way of thinking, your way of viewing the world into the book without looking at what did the guy. Certainly, the guy who wrote it meant something. He knew what he was talking about, and if you assume that you know what he was talking about, we all know what happens when you assume.
Yeah.
Somebody had their hand raised. Who was that, Gracie?
Well, it just makes me think you've got the law of the land, but you've got the law of physics, and you've got the law of gravity and the law of all kinds of things even today.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have nothing to do with each other.
It's a key insight that Mike mentioned a moment ago, that when you read Paul talking about the law of sin and death, he is referring to multiple things. He's not just, you don't just say the word law, nomos, in Greek and assume that they're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. You can't do that. You've got to look at the context. Tracy?
I wanted to talk about that yoke thing that Peter was talking about.
Yeah.
And how when Messiah was admonishing those Pharisees and scribes
Yes.
for putting
A heavy yoke.
heavy yoke of burdens on people, it was their own words. And that's what it said in Jeremiah 23. It says, thus, King James, you shall say everyone to his neighbor and everyone to his brother, what has the Lord answered and what has the Lord spoken? And the burden of Yahweh shall you not mention any more, for every man's word shall be his burden. For he has perverted the words of the living God, of the Lord of hosts of God. And that's what's happening here.
Yeah. And you can see Messiah admonishing people. These Pharisees are trying to put a heavy yoke on people, but they themselves are not willing to lift a little finger to do it. But my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
And the flesh will pervert the word of God. That's what Satan does. He takes his word. He doesn't take his own word. He takes God's word. And he appeals to your flesh because your flesh can't hear the Spirit.
Yeah.
You can only hear the Spirit by abiding in Messiah and abiding in His word and saying, you teach me. And not going to men. And it's okay if you go and you're trying to get a little information or whatever, but this needs to be your source. That's what I'm always trying to tell people.
Yeah. This needs to be your source, and I think that that's a critical thing. Yes. The Bible needs to be your source.
Through Messiah, though.
Through Messiah and through the Spirit of God. But don't let me say to you, hear me say, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. There are great men in the faith. Regular old Christian run-of-the-mill guys. E.W. Bullinger, Schofield. These guys have brilliant, amazing, Spirit-led insight into the Word of God. But if you don't read it yourself and you don't think critically, you'll trip over all kinds of people's opinions about stuff. But it's hard not to. It's really hard not to. Jerry?
I'm just going to throw out a little nugget here. There's a lot of sects today that believe that the law is bondage.
Oh
They
yeah,
think they're going to go to heaven, so they're going to be awfully miserable in the millennial kingdom
yeah, sure, yeah, absolutely,
because they're going to be
absolutely,
living under the law.
sure. And I think that we have all come to recognize that the law it's a law of freedom, just like James
You need to
says.
read Psalm 119.
Yeah, it's the law of liberty, and the Torah is so much about freedom and liberty for us. John?
I only wonder from when the discussion was going on, I don't know if it is right here, but between the Gentiles, and what can the Gentiles do to be in a way join the whole group
sure.
between the Jews and the Gentiles,
Mhm.
then say, you know what, in order that you guys can actually be with us and share our faith, you only have to do 4 things.
Yes, that's coming up right in the, you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, it's always good.
No,
especially
I agree.
Why not talk then about
Sure,
circumcision?
absolutely.
We'll explain it.
So let me point out, we talked about when they use the word, they must be instructed to keep the Torah of Moses. They're not talking about just the first 5 books, or Peter would not have said this is a huge yoke which has been tripping us up and we can't do it. Why would you want to put it on them? Okay, but then that would seem weird because James would contradict that in just a minute. So we know that that's not what it's talking about. But also know that when these sect of the Pharisees and certain people from Judea were entering into the fellowship and saying, we really need to circumcise these Gentiles who are joining the faith, you need to also know that when they say that, they are not necessarily saying they must physically be circumcised. Circumcision is a code word for you must convert to Judaism. You must, here's an example. I'll throw it out to you this way. You get together with your neighbor and you preach the gospel to them, and they're having a hard time, and you're sharing your faith with them, and their eyes are opened and their ears are opened, and they begin to hear what you're saying, and they seem like they're really interested, and you begin to talk to them. Now, they start getting serious about it, and you can tell that their heart's on fire, and they want to know this God and this Yeshua who died for them. And then they're like, I want to go to a fellowship. What are you going to tell them? Oh, well, okay. You don't want to go to the Mormon tabernacle down the road there because you don't want to do that. Don't go to a Catholic church. What are we doing? We're steering them into what our interpretation is, and we're saying, you really need to go to this kind of church, okay? Or, when you see where I'm headed with this? We have our own interpretation of the way things are done. We're called a Messianic Judaism, Hebrew roots, back to the basics, whatever you want to call us, I have no idea. But we have a certain way of doing things. We have a certain way of interpreting scriptures. We have a certain way of carrying them out. So do the Baptists. So do the Presbyterians, okay? So these Jews are behaving in the exact same way that you or I would. If someone comes to the knowledge of Christ, we want to lead them in the faith that we know and love. Our tradition. This is our tradition, right? You might say, well, we're not engaged in tradition. Well, no, not necessarily. We're not. But you know that the Baptists have a bunch of traditions, and so do these other religions. These Jews are thinking very rationally, saying, wait a minute. We have been worshiping God for thousands of years, and anybody who wanted to worship our God, what did they do? They went to the synagogue, because that's where God is worshipped, or at the temple in Jerusalem, and this is the religion that people practice who worship God. So if you want to join us, you kind of have to do things the way we do them. And that is the issue. When they say they must be circumcised and follow the customs of Moses, what they're basically saying is, you must convert to Judaism and do things the way we do them, or you really are not part of this family. You're really not a part of this kingdom.
It's important to note that those people were Messianic that were
Yes,
saying that. And
these
they
are not
didn't-
evil. These are not evil Pharisees who are showing up and infiltrating the system.
And
These
they
are
never got
believers.
any idea that the law had been done away with.
No. But they are thinking rationally and normally, saying, we've been doing this for a long time. If you want to worship our God, you really need to do it this way. And then Peter and Paul stand up and say, you guys, whoa, that's not true. And they give the example of Cornelius. Peter gives his testimony and says, man, I was called to this dude's house and the Holy Spirit came on them and they were Gentiles, just exactly like he did to us on the day of Pentecost when the tongues of fire came down and we started speaking in different languages. The same thing happened to those guys. They have never followed the Torah. Now Cornelius might have. He was one who was called a God-fearer. It says he gave alms and loved the Jewish people and went to synagogue and such. But is it necessary to convert to Judaism in order to be a part of this thing? They naturally thought so. But the disciples are saying, no, that's not true. They don't have to convert to Judaism. Now, converting to Judaism and keeping the Torah are two very different things. You need to make a great big distinction between truth and religion. The two can sometimes mix, and sometimes we think of religion as the Bible. They are not the same. You know that the word religion is not even found in your Bible, except in the book of James, and I don't even think that's correctly translated as religion. God hates religion. I don't think he's interested in religion at all. He's interested in you worshiping him in spirit and truth, not in a religious ceremony. If you want to come up with a bunch of religious ceremonies, and people do, as long as they're not pagan or whacked out in some way or violation of the commandment, have at it. Do all the traditions you want. That's fabulous. Who cares? Nobody cares as long as you're keeping the Torah and you have the spirit of the Torah and you're doing what the Torah says. You can light candles and do anything you want. It's fine. Just remember, it's not a commandment. It's a tradition. Daryl.
Well, that's why I think it's important to understand that Torah really means God's teaching and instruction.
Instructions, yes.
That's
Great.
what it means.
Great insight.
It does mean the first 5 books,
yeah.
But it also means all of his teaching and instruction.
Yes. And that's why they can say in Timothy, all Scripture is proper for instruction and stuff. You remember when they wrote that, there was no New Testament?
Yeah.
It wasn't talking about the New Testament. Tammy?
I was going to say, Galatians 5:1 and 2. If you want to read that, it just says, it talks a little bit about the yoke of bondage. And so I just wrote this down, but the yoke of bondage, the yoke was a sign of slavery to Christians, and they were told not to become entangled with that yoke, right? So I don't know if this kind of goes a little bit of what you guys are talking about.
I think it absolutely does.
That's
The
the same
yoke
time
of
period.
bondage is it's the same thing that we're talking about. And I think, and you can clear up for yourself so much trouble in the book of Galatians if you recognize the couple of things that we've been talking about here. When Paul talks about the law in some places, and especially in the book of Galatians, he is directly addressing in the book of Galatians that certain people have crept in and are teaching these people in Galatia, you must convert to Judaism and become literally physically circumcised or you cannot enter the kingdom. And he is saying, based on what has happened here in Acts chapter 15, based on Peter's testimony, based on James being led by the Spirit and putting down the gavel at the Jerusalem council and saying, not true. Do not believe that. You do not need to convert to Judaism. You do not need to literally be physically circumcised in order to be saved. It is not true. I want to address briefly, what time is it? Am I getting really long-winded? Okay, are we doing okay? Are you guys breathing all right?
Did you have something that you were going to say?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit?
I was
Yeah.
just going to say,
Sorry.
you're making the point that Peter was not saying the law was burdensome. The Torah was burdensome. I, of course, think that as well. But in light of what John mentioned about the truncated Torah, don't we have to interpret that they were referring to the actual Torah as we understand it? Because he says, okay, you're right, this is too much. At least follow these things.
So you're talking
Don't
about
need anything
the four
strangled.
things? Okay.
Don't need anything strangled.
Yeah.
Don't need anything with his blood in it. and there's the 4 rules.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when you look at that subset, that's not some weird, Talmudic thing. That's not some weird.
No, those are
burden.
straight. Yeah, those are straight up.
It doesn't even say don't commit adultery or steal stuff. I mean, that didn't even make the cut.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, it would make it seem like when they were referring to something that was too burdensome, that does need to be truncated or made a little lighter.
Okay.
It is referring to the Torah as we understand it, because
Okay.
those are all. It's a subset.
Okay, I'll play with you for a second. I'll play in. Let's try this out. Hope you'll humor me.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question. Anybody if wants to answer it. In your reading of the book of Deuteronomy or Exodus or Leviticus or something, have you read about something in the Torah that you find would be really challenging to do? Would be burdensome, how about put it that way?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Women during their monthly uncleanness.
Okay. So you say that would be a burden to the woman or to you?
Everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just see if I've got this straight. During a woman's time of menstruation, most people have a bit of an understanding about this that says,
We're probably
okay.
breaking it right now.
Well, okay, so let's say that we're going to take the woman who is menstruating and we're going to kick her out of the camp. We're going to make her go out into the wilderness. Is that your understanding of what's happening here?
It's in relation to the temple and the tabernacle and drawing near to that area.
Well, let's think about it at the time that it was given, like when they're wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, and suddenly we have a portion of the camp which is going to be forced to go outside the camp. Is it your interpretation that this seems really sexist and horrible, that we're going to take our wives and we're going to kick them out of the camp when it's their time for their period?
I think it's
Teach
a health
men
code.
how to cook.
I think it's a health code. I don't think it's something spiritual.
No, what? No, hold on. No, wait a minute. Carla, I think that you're absolutely right. Because I think that what this is this. Many people have this idea that we're going to take these women and we're going to say, woman, get out. You go. You're not allowed here right now. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. And if you read in the Talmud and you read about how this was actually interpreted and how it was practiced, it was more, and I'll just sum this up for you in this way. Every month, the woman gets a spa week. There is a designated place outside of the camp where there are lots of women. Do you know what happens with a bunch of women who are having their period or living together? What do? They synchronize. Did you notice that? I know you know that. Women's periods synchronize when they have... For all I know, you could... I'm sorry. Women's periods synchronize. And so you're going to have a group of women outside the camp hanging out together, fellowshipping. They don't have to cook. They don't have to clean. They don't have to take care of the children for a whole week. Is that a burden? That's a burden for you.
Well, no, I just think it's a difficult one, and so difficult that it is something that people do not follow even in Torah.
Okay. Yes, I will grant you that none of us are probably going to do that. But you know what? If we were going to spiritualize that commandment, fireworks, sorry. If we were going to spiritualize that commandment, and I seriously suggest that we do, I should treat my wife during that period of menstruation with kid gloves. Give her some time off.
Literally,
maybe
you can't touch her.
That's right. No.
Literally kid gloves.
But maybe I should help cook. Maybe I should help clean. Maybe I should give her some physical time off. I certainly shouldn't come near her in a sexual way, because that's forbidden. But I hope that I've addressed, maybe you would agree, that that's not necessarily burdensome. To physically carry out that command and say, wife, you going to, what do I got to send my wife to a hotel once a month?
No,
I'm saying that's one of the
it doesn't mean that it's going. I never understood it to mean that they were put outside the camp. They didn't have their own little place to be, and they were ostracized. I've never looked at that as being ostracized.
Well, you would be an anomaly, I think, because many people, without really thinking about it, go, gosh, that doesn't sound very nice. We're just going to kick the ladies outside of the camp and...
Well, doesn't it say that
No, but I think people look at it that way.
They were in a camp
Okay, hold on.
It says anything they touch, you don't touch, it has to be cleaned. And
Yeah,
it says that.
and I think there are ritualistic purity things that Tracy mentioned having to do with the temple, and that would be a foreshadowing kind of thing, and I think that that is a good point. But I hope that I wanted to just address with you briefly, if you're aware of commandments in the Torah which would be burdensome, and I'm not aware of any, not a single one. Yes?
How about the Jubilee year?
We don't know what it is.
But they did.
Yeah. Now here's a good point. Even if we
one
did
total
know.
year of
Yeah.
restraining, and also giving back everything that's owed.
Sure. Yes, and that's an excellent point. And I think that what you would have to consider in that case is that the law of the land, as we are in exile, we couldn't keep that if we wanted to.
This isn't our land.
It's not our land. It's not,
Now we could not.
Yeah, we could not right now. But I
if they
mean,
were in a situation where they could obey it, and they did, once they experienced 1 time of that section of time, and seeing how Jehovah took care of them, it would be thrilling.
oh, absolutely,
Absolutely thrilling. You'd look forward to
Yeah.
this assurance from Him every so
right,
many years.
right. And so I want us to say, if we're going to talk about the Torah being a burden, I don't want us to look at it from the sense of, well, we can't do that today, because that's not what I mean by a burden. I mean, we don't have a temple, we can't make sacrifices, that would be a burden. Well, yeah, because it's not set up that way. But I'm talking about the commandments that you yourself can and should keep that are written in the Torah for you. Remember that there are 613 of them, and not all of them apply to you. Some of them only apply to women, some of them only apply to men, some of them only apply to children, some of them only apply to priests and Levites and kings and commanders and lepers and soldiers. Okay, so not all of them apply to you. But the ones that do apply to you, are there any in there that you would find just, man, this is a drag? No. I'm telling you right now, search it out.
Especially if you understand it. And
Yeah,
that's what,
certainly.
the key.
There's nothing burdensome there. That's my whole point.
The key is, no man cometh unto the Father but by me, through Jesus. And if you have come to the Father through His Son and His work on the cross, you've got the indwelling Spirit, and it's a whole different mindset.
Yes. I want to serve.
Not 100% perfection,
Yeah.
but a total.
Sure. It should change your mind at least. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, when I talk to people about observing the Shabbat, their biggest concern is that's going to be so burdensome. What would I do with my time? It's like they could in their mind they actually want to do it. Some of the people, but they just think of burden without, like what you said, without understanding on a blessing it would be instead of a burden.
It's a burden to the flesh.
There's a good point.
To the spirit.
Well, yeah,
Which ties right back in with our teaching about circumcision and getting rid of the flesh.
But I'm still looking on the Sabbath for what am I supposed to be doing?
I totally understand, because we are so uncomfortable. It's a day to do nothing, and that is uncomfortable. That is a little bit of a burden to start out, because you're like, your flesh wants to do something. It's like, that's why worship, like when Abraham puts his face to the ground, this is worship, not waving flags and playing tambourines and jamming on the drums, singing songs. That's not worship. That's never described as worship in the Bible. Worship is doing nothing, with your face to the ground, not speaking, not doing anything. Praying, speaking to God. I'm not saying literally with your face to the ground, but there's nothing for your flesh to do. It's horribly boring for your flesh, but it feeds your spirit. That's the way some things are.
But it is horribly important.
It is terribly, terribly important.
While we were talking about Acts 15, maybe you could point out, like in the first part we talked about how this reference to Moses may have also been oral, right? But then there's another reference to Moses being taught in the synagogues.
Yes.
And that is pointing out.
Good point, Mike.
Read.
Good point, Mike. Yes, absolutely. Let's take a look here. Okay. For example, if you were, let's just continue on with this book of Acts thing for just a moment, because some of you have pointed out, okay, what are these 4 little instructions, 3 of which we don't even keep? One, well, apparently we don't keep that one either.
Oh yeah, one we don't even do today, the blood. And
yeah, so, okay, so let's take a look at this. this is where James, being a good judge, listens to all sides and begins to deliberate. Led by the Spirit of God, he issues a judgment. In verse 19, he says, after quoting some passages from Amos, "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the nations who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from the defilement of idols." Okay, so I'm going to make a note here to myself here. Number one, can somebody offer me a slightly, let me offer you, a different translation, okay? Literal translation of the Greek. That we write to them to be abstaining from ceremonial pollution with idols. What does that mean to you? Many of your Bibles, what do some of your other Bibles say? Meat sacrificed to idols? Does anybody have that?
Pollution of idols.
The pollution of idols, okay.
Talk about temple prostitutes and.
Okay, so I wanted to briefly discuss that just so we could characterize it correctly. How would you summarize that? Stay away from
Sacrificing to idols.
And if it were food sacrificed to idols, we would today come into contact with that with halal meat.
Right. But it doesn't actually say anything about the word meat or food is not in there at all. It's literally
False gods, heathen gods.
Yeah.
Also.
It's basically abstain from ceremonial pollution with idols. Okay, so this is basically, if we summarize this in any way that makes sense today, we could say stay away from idolatry, right?
Which is all over the Torah.
Yeah, which is also all over the Torah. Okay, so we'll say abstain from idolatry. So that's the number one thing that he tells them.
Hopefully that would mean something to us today, something concrete, because James has it in his big ordinance.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked many times about idolatry, and we can briefly review that if you need to, but just remember that there are very few people on this planet these days. Well, China has a very large percentage of the world's population. They do bow down to idols, literally. But most people don't. But we've also talked many times about how idolatry is anything that you elevate to the place of God in your life. Your idol could be money. Your idol could be sex. Your idol could be your children. Sports. Absolutely. There are tons of idols. There are tons of idols. Anything that takes your fear or takes your adoration, it takes your time. Just what's exactly, you shall love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and resources. If your heart, soul, and resources are going to something on a regular basis, spend a lot of time doing it, that might be an idol. Okay, so we're just going to leave it at that. Number one, abstain from idolatry. Number two, it literally says fornication. Okay, that's the Hebrew word porneia. You might think pornography, that would also be included. Okay, yes, this is sexual immorality. Okay, so number two is sexual immorality. Number three is literally, this is a strange one, but when you look at this in context with first century writings in Judaism, what is strangled is called treif. You heard that word? That is a way of actually summarizing the dietary laws in one word. Treif. Unfit for consumption. So, the gist of strangled is literally treif. Stay away from anything that is unfit for consumption. That would mean the biblical laws regarding what is food and what is not.
Well, also strangled meat would mean meat with the blood in it, I would assume.
Well, that comes next. Okay, so let's just draw this down for just a second in your mind, okay? Because this is such a weird translation, but all of your translations say strangled, okay? Because that doesn't mean anything to us. What do we strangle any meat who strangles meat?
Somebody.
I mean, you can catch a rabbit in a snare and it's literally been strangled, but that's not how people kill animals, nor has it ever been how people kill animals. Even the Muslims don't kill animals by strangling them. Okay, so you might get people get tripped up on this whole strangulation thing. A better, more culturally accurate way to look at this is called trafe, which simply is a first century way of saying something that is not fit for consumption. So I'm just going to wrap that up with number 3, saying food. Stay away from unclean foods. Number 4 is blood.
So it could be clean food with blood.
Could be.
Yeah.
But you're covering both bases by saying what is unclean and from blood. Because you can eat blood without eating the unclean meat. And people do all over the world still have blood in all kinds of different countries. Do they have it in Denmark?
In Holland?
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to eat blood.
Sure.
It was normal.
Blood pudding.
Horse meat.
Sure.
Horse blood.
Okay. So, I mean, black pudding in England, that's blood.
Yeah.
Pig blood with, sauces and stuff mixed in and turn it into sausage and slice it up and fry it. Yeah, they're totally eating blood. Okay, so number 4 is blood. Now, some people have said this is the 4 things that are super important that, like, the Gentiles should do, and everything else, just let that go by the wayside.
Read the next verse.
Yes, we shall. And that's critical to this.
And it's important to point out that all these things are found in Leviticus 17 and 18, which are the judgments of
Yes.
Yahweh, which is like
This is the heart of the Torah.
It's not even
Yes.
10.
Right. Okay. So, and I would say this. Let's say that you were witnessing to someone in a prison ministry or something. Okay. They were in prison for murder. Some guy who raped a woman and killed her, and he was also a drug addict. And he could get saved, and he's going to get out on parole in 10 years. Or maybe he's been in prison for 40 years, and he's about to get out. He's an old man, and you want to advise him on how to live his life. Or someone who just converts him, whatever it is, okay? What are you going to tell that person? Well, if you want to follow God, maybe a good place to start is to not kill people, don't rape women, and stay away from drugs. Because you know that is this dude's problem. Or if we converted a prostitute, we'd say, man, first step for you, stop selling your body for sex. That would be a good first step for you. What you'll want to note about each of these things is that they are very prevalent among the Gentiles. Eating idolatry, my gosh, that's everywhere. It's entirely common. If you eat meat at all, it has most likely been offered to an idol. Paul talks about that in Corinthians. Now, he's got his own take on that. However, keep that in mind. Sexual immorality, oh my goodness, it's all over in the first century. It's part of their religious worship. It's commonplace. Eating food that's unclean, no problem there. Gentiles do it all the time. Eating blood, they're still doing it today. Some of these things seem weird to us because they're placed into a weird context, but when you think about it, stay away from idolatry. Sexual purity is important. Eating foods that are unclean is important. Don't do that. And stay away from blood. Now, the key thing here is, yes, those are 4 critical things, and they are the heart of the Torah. That is, Tracy is correct. Those are considered the heart of the Torah. These are like some of the most important things. But then you notice that it says in that very next verse, for Moses has those who preach him in every synagogue, in every city. A couple of interesting things. I personally interpret this passage to mean that James is saying, look, these Gentiles who are turning to God from among the nations, let's start them off with some big ones. Stay away from idolatry. Stay away from sexual immorality. Stay away from food that has been sacrificed and food that is unclean. And stay away from blood. And then you'll be able to join into the fellowship of other believers with this God. Where are you going to do that? The only place you're going to do that is a synagogue. There are no churches. Not a single one.
Moses is even recommended in that one verse.
Right. Now hold on to that thought for just a sec. Hold on to that thought for a sec, okay? So the only place you're going to worship this God in this time period is a synagogue. And there are synagogues in every city all over the world.
Every Sabbath day.
Every Sabbath day, Moses has those who preach him in every city, okay?
It also says red.
Yes.
So there's a difference between
And that is the same today.
and the oral.
That is correct.
Referencing.
Absolutely correct. Okay, so I'm going to just point out two things, and then we'll wrap this up. And we can talk about it more afterwards, and you can ask questions and whatnot. But I want to just point out two things. Number one, to the Gentiles, let's say this. You guys, if you want to become members of the family of God, you have to break away from these minimum four things. You won't be welcomed into the fellowship. You'll be kicked out immediately if you're idolaters, sexually immoral. If you're bringing unclean foods into the assembly, eating blood in the assembly. You will not be welcomed into the fellowship. You can't fellowship with the people in the synagogue if you commit these sins. These are the minimum requirements in order to get together with other people. And here Moses read. In a synagogue today, they don't teach the Talmud. They don't teach the Gemara and the Talmud in any way. If you go to a synagogue today, they're still reading, what are they reading every week? The Parshas. They have been for thousands of years. They read Moses every week. And then they will preach, teach. What does it mean? They're still doing it today. It's the same thing. So, stick to these four basic minimums and you'll be able to join the congregation and start learning. And you'll hear Moses every Shabbat.
And that's why this circumcision thing is repeated in Galatians, because they are in this area now. Like it says they're in Antioch, and I think in 14, which is in Galatia, and then in 16 it talks about them being in Galatia.
Right.
And so this argument is taking place there as well, and he's speaking to Galatians who didn't have the law, so they can't return to the weak and beggarly things of the law, because that's not what they had.
Right.
It's the weak and beggarly things of the world and these things that he's telling them to turn away from here in Acts 15.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I hope that has answered some questions for you. Like I said, don't take my word for all this stuff. Look it up. Look into it some more and find out what's going on, because there's a lot of misunderstanding there. Does anyone have any final observations or questions before we wrap up? I've gone over by a little bit, and I apologize.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, good discussion tonight.
You know what's sad is how bad the church in general has missed this.
Yeah, you know what I would I'll do you one better, Daryl. It is unfortunate that the people of God have botched the operation throughout history. It doesn't matter whether it's the church or the people in the wilderness, it doesn't matter. We have all botched it. And I'll tell you what, when I read the Torah, and I'm honest with myself, I used to all the time say, golly, those people were dumb. I don't do that anymore. I used to do that a lot when I would read the Torah and see what happened in the wilderness and all these things and the prophets. I'd be, good Lord, these people are retarded. They just don't know what's going on, and wow. But you know what? Now I say, my gosh, we are dumb. All of us. We have been through all of history, and this just gives me it's the grace of God.
We want our kids to learn from us and not by what we.
Yeah,
we can't
seriously.
even look at our own history.
No, and I think that is a humbling experience when we begin to really see this Torah and we begin to read it and go, by golly, we haven't been doing this either. And we can't point our fingers back to the ancient Israelites and go, wow, how did they miss that? We missed it completely, and we still screw it up today. But by the grace of God, it's amazing.
But until we're willing to admit that we are any different than them, we won't get anywhere.
Absolutely. That's a great point. We need to recognize we are no better. And this is a mantra that I try to live by. I know nothing. I really don't know anything. Then I advise you to think the same. We know nothing. We're just getting started.
Nothing apart from me. That is a branch apart from the climb.
Yeah.
Do nothing apart from me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start there. Let's start fresh. Let's start there. We know nothing.
So if you're interested in doing nothing, do not be a believer.
Oh, by the way, it'll be cast out, thrown through fire.
Yeah. All right, let's pray.